Welcome back to session 2. We're so glad that you took that next step coming back, and we're really excited to dive in to week 2. See, any medic will tell you that the 2 most important life necessities are breathing and circulation. So imagine stitching up a bad wound and then watching that person tear out the stitches as soon as they walk out of the aid station. How frustrating would that be?
Very.
How self-defeating would that be?
Very.
What advice would you give that person?
Stop.
You'd probably say, stop tearing out the stitches. You'll never get better if you keep injuring yourself.
That's right.
While this seems like common sense, how many times have we looked at the wounds of our trauma and either ignored them or done something that makes them worse? See, a big part of trauma healing is limiting exposure to new trauma. In other words, prevention is absolutely part of the intervention. We said last week that trauma is a wound that can heal if proper steps are taken. The operative words in that statement are if and proper. Over the years at Reboot, we've studied the trauma response of thousands of service members and their families, and we've identified a set of 4 default responses. By default, we mean those actions that people tend to take without applying intentional discipline or choices. Here are the 4 primary default responses. First, we deny, then we cry, then we numb, then we run. Well, these are steps many people take. They aren't the proper ones. Rather than making things better, they make things worse. They pull us further away from our goal of a healthier, happier life. But just because they may be our default responses doesn't mean that they are unavoidable. In fact, we can learn to prevent our knee-jerk reactions of denying, crying, numbing, and running, and instead respond with choices that lead to healing. But before we learn how to respond productively, we must understand how these default responses work so that we can spot them when they crop up. Jose, why don't you tell them about the first response?
Sure thing. Here it is. First, we deny. Often in the face of trauma, our natural response is denial. Service members often display a remarkable ability to shield themselves from reality. For example, we try not to think about the very real possibility of getting hurt or killed on a mission, even though it could absolutely happen. Another example is that we may not let ourselves fully consider the strain that moving every few years can place on a marriage that is already struggling. Truthfully, none of us is immune to getting stuck in denial when our lives slip into crisis. When our world is shaken to its core, our involuntary response is to deny that the experience will have any long-term impact on our lives. We try to downplay the severity of the experience and brush it under the rug as a temporary struggle. We live under a mantra of this too shall pass, even though the trouble clearly isn't going anywhere. Our denial isn't driven by stupidity or ignorance. It's a natural response to unwelcome information. Denial happens when our new reality is incongruent with the way we saw our lives playing out. For example, we envisioned serving for 25 years and retiring from the military, but after only 4 years, we were medically discharged. So now what? When our post-trauma reality becomes too complicated, confusing, or painful to fit into how we saw our lives playing out, the default response is denial. Feeling overwhelmed, we stuff all our feelings in an emotional trash can and promise to deal with them someday. But someday keeps getting pushed further and further and further away. We procrastinate because to feel any part of it would mean feeling all of it at once. And that feels totally overwhelming. We strive to preserve reality as it used to be rather than adapting to how it is now. Gradually, whether we want to or not, we must face the real reality. We must acknowledge and process the trauma that we experience no matter how much we want to deny it. We face this truth. Either we deal with the trauma or the trauma will deal with us. Take a few minutes to discuss the subject of denial. Your local leader will guide you through a few questions, and then we'll come back with our second default response to trauma.
First, we deny, then we cry. When denial is no longer possible, we must confront the full extent of trauma's damage, leading to a surge of complex emotions. Rage, sudden panic, and heavy sadness sweep over us at the drop of a hat. These emotions are not like other emotions. They feel more primal and less manageable. Like a boiling pot of water, our emotions seem to simmer up at a low temperature until just when we stop paying attention, they bubble over in an instant. Without a productive place to channel these emotions, we become symptomatic and start experiencing anxiety and depression. The longer a trauma goes unaddressed, the more symptomatic we are likely to become. Eventually, our innate coping mechanisms can no longer hold our growing emotional, mental, and spiritual unrest at bay, so we look for reinforcements in the form of emotional painkillers and numbing agents. This leads to our third default response. First, we deny, then we cry, and next, we numb. One of the most dangerous illnesses to an elderly patient is pneumonia. That's because pneumonia deals a severe blow to a person's immune system, which can quickly turn an underlying condition into a deadly illness. In a similar way, trauma reduces the defense systems of your heart and mind and leaves you more vulnerable to making unwise choices. After your defenses are lowered, rest assured that you'll have no shortage of go-to painkillers at your disposal. Drugs, alcohol, sex, shopping, video games, self-harm, social media, and dozens of other distractions will feel like lifeboats when they're actually heavy anchors holding you back from your healing. Attempting to numb from unaddressed trauma will take you to places you never thought you'd go and leave you there all alone. For some of us, numbing is all we've ever known. God gave us a set of responses to trauma known as fight, flight, or freeze. If you experienced trauma as a child, it's very likely that your body triggered a numbing or freeze response. After all, you were just a kid and probably couldn't fight or flee. Your little mind and body weren't able to process what was happening, so your brain flipped on a numbing switch as an act of self-preservation. This allowed you to disassociate from the reality of what was happening. In other words, it helped you survive in those moments. But here's the truth. Numbing as a child may have kept you alive. However, numbing as an adult may kill you. Wow. While numbing out and disassociating may have been survival mechanisms that were helpful as a child, they will likely become harmful behaviors as an adult. They will delay your healing and inch you closer toward addiction or self-destruction. No matter the painkiller of choice, you will require more frequent and stronger doses to stay numb. So you'll start to run, which is the fourth default response to trauma. We run. We run from numbing agent to numbing agent. We run from one military school to another. We run from retirement to a contract job that we know we're not mentally prepared for. Tragically, many of us will run from one traumatic experience to another. Running from our past requires a tremendous amount of time and energy. Some of the most exhausted Reboot participants are those who are fighting to stay numb.
That's so good.
When we run, we invest our time in distractions rather than working to build a life worth living. Like a rocking chair, there's a lot of movement going on, but we're not getting anywhere. Sure, we'll experience some temporary relief, but when it wears off, we will either be back where we started or even further away from our goal. If we aren't careful, we can end up running for the rest of our lives, and that's no way to live. The choice is ours. We can deny the trauma or deal with it. We can run from it or stand up to it. Default responses are natural, but they aren't unavoidable. We can choose. Let's take a moment and look at a story found in your field guide about a fictitious service member and see what we can learn from their responses to trauma.
Notice that one path brings Officer Green closer to freedom. It helps him establish strong character, connects him with a healthy community, and eventually allows him to become a leader. Those are the choices you wrote down, right? Good choices that lead to freedom. The other path leads towards death. It's filled with choices that result in addiction, divorce, isolation, and in too many cases, among our veterans, suicide. If we wish to heal, we must stop doing what feels natural and begin applying a supernatural response. Data surrounding veteran suicide paints a very, very dark picture. The horrendous statistics may lead us to believe that the trend of veterans dying by suicide is irreversible. But hear me clearly. Choices are stronger than statistics. The data may say that coming from where you came from, you should be a deadbeat, you should be a loser. The statistics and the law of averages may predict that you should have already been 6 feet in the ground by now, and yet here you are in Reboot, right now, learning how to embrace your brighter future. A big reason why is that you have chosen a path of humility. You know, when we're talking about humility, when we're in our groups and whatnot, we're not talking about thinking poorly or more lowly of yourself. No. We're actually talking about vulnerability. We're talking about a willingness to open up and let others in, even if it means risking that they may think less of you. Humility invites others to help us. You'll see this in your field guide. Pride pushes them away. Humility enables God to enter into our pain. Pride says, no, I can do it on my own. I can do it alone. That's right. Humility listens to wise counsel. Pride rejects the advice of others. Good. Humility leads to healing. Hear me now. Pride leads to destruction. Pride pushes away help on the outside, right? Pushes it away, and it locks the pain away on the inside. Without vulnerability, we are all wasting our time pretending to be stronger or healthier than we actually are. That's why healing from trauma requires vulnerability. It's a risk-reward scenario. You have to be willing to put yourself in the hands of others, to entrust them with your story in order to build trust with the team that you'll need to heal. It's not easy, and it's the total opposite of what your brain will tell you to do, but you can't skip this part. Brian talked about the 4 default responses, right? Humility is not one of them, but humility is the first step that's necessary towards healing. You can't win the war against trauma alone. The enemy is too strong. Trust me, I've seen people fight him alone. He's too strong and he's too clever. You are outnumbered. You're outgunned. You need others. But you can't let others in while keeping your guard up. The only hope you have is to let humility lead you to healing. Counterintuitively, when it comes to the kind of war you're in, the fight of your life that we talked about last week, you find victory through surrender. You find victory through surrender. So as we close, I want to give you a chance in your groups to practice some honesty, some humility, some vulnerability, as we bypass our natural response and do something truly supernatural. In your field guides, you'll see a spot to write down some of your go-to painkillers and numbing agents. Remember, there's no judgment or comparison in Reboot groups. There's not ones in the groups that we're in, and there shouldn't be in yours. This is an opportunity to show grace, mercy, love, and support. This is your opportunity to practice some vulnerability, to start letting the people in the room, the people God has assembled to be your fighting force, to say, let's help stand beside you and win this battle together. Because together you guys will continue to take steps towards healing. You won't be denying and crying and numbing and running. Instead, you'll be opening up and learning to win. So thank you guys so much for joining us for session number 2. We cannot wait to see you next week for, I promise, what will be an incredibly impactful session in your life. We'll see you then.